Happy New Year, everyone. 2022 is finally here. I hope you all had a good 2021. For me, it was pretty mixed, personally and just globally. Things are still kind of not great. I spent the majority of my 2021 indoors watching movies, which I'm sure will come as a great shock to all of you. This year did feel different than the last couple years, primarily because I feel like I enjoyed the stuff I saw this year much more on average. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about my favorite movies that were released in 2021 that I saw in 2021. So if there are any notable exceptions, they probably just didn't fit those parameters, or I didn't like them. That's also an option. There's no particular order or ranking here, just the movies that I connected with the most and the ones that gave me the most to think about, the ones that have stuck with me the longest. So let's just jump in. And the first movie I selected is Annette. Annette is a very, very, very weird movie, but also very intentionally so. The story's about a famous stand-up comedian and a famous opera singer who have a baby together, and that baby has a magical, unique gift that completely changes the course of their lives. This is unlike any movie musical I've seen before, and what really struck me about it is how it embraces the idea of artificiality. The way the sets are designed, the way music is integrated into the story, and even the scale and direction the story goes in. At every turn, the movie is about the relationship between fact and fiction and how that relationship informs artists and stories about artists. It's also about fame, but not in some bland fame is bad kind of way. It's more about the emptiness of fame when used as a source of maintaining your own happiness and your own sense of stability, and the more that the characters try to fill that emotional hole within themselves with fame, the more they can't really fill it with anything else. Just a lot of really interesting ideas about what fuels creation. However, like I said, it's fairly weird, it's pretty out there, and I think a lot of people will not connect with it. I would not recommend this across the board to everyone, but I think it has a lot to offer, a lot to say, and the way those things are said is truly unlike anything I've seen before.
It's time to start, baby, start, baby, start. Time to start.
My next selection is Bad Trip. This movie is another hidden camera prank comedy, similar to something like Borat, but the comedic motivation is completely different. The concept is that Eric Andre and Lil Rel Howery are starring in the most cliched rom-com plot imaginable, but they play out the scenes of that rom-com plot in front of unsuspecting real people. Essentially, the movie has one joke, just how would people react to this scene, but that joke never gets old. The real people that you encounter across this story are so wonderful and so memorable because they just kind of want to help out when these things start happening. The variety and the specificity of reactions are hilarious, but what's so interesting is how the people get so quickly invested in what's happening, and you kind of can't help but get invested yourself based on that. And the movie is not taking itself seriously at all. This is a movie where Eric Andre gets by a gorilla. It's not going for Oscars. But the fact that even these ridiculous scenarios can provoke these real moments of human connection and emotion, it's kind of beautiful. It's really heartwarming. Every time I watch this movie, I laugh harder, and I really hope that this weird little subgenre of comedy movies can keep going and keep producing stuff like this, because this is just fantastic. My next selection will surprise nobody at all. It's Dune, baby. I love Dune so much, and I honestly still can't believe how much I love Dune. Simply put, it's everything an adaptation should be. The technical flawlessness, the way it reshapes and reframes the original story, the new elements it brings in to serve the medium better, and the fact that this movie does with one half of one book what most movies can't do in trilogies. It's also everything I want from a blockbuster, where the scale of the story and the action is so enormous and so impressive, but that human element is never lost. As expansive and as detailed and as textured as the lore and the world and the story can be, you never lose that human emotion pulling everything together. together. It's just really astonishing how real this movie is able to feel. It's almost hypnotic in a way. Every time I've watched this movie in IMAX or on my couch, I have just felt so drawn into it, and I know that I will continue that loop until part 2 comes out, because I have never been more excited for a movie than I'm excited for part 2. But part 1, phenomenal. Everything I could have asked for, and so much more. My next selection is The French Dispatch. This was the latest movie from Quirkmaster Supreme Wes Anderson, and I love his movies so much. I really like that every one of his movies seems to be getting progressively more and more Anderson-y, and this is perhaps the most Anderson-y movie yet. It's basically 3 Anderson movies for the price of 1, and the story is centralized around this idea of a magazine selling its final issue and celebrating the best stories they've told. So obviously, this movie functions as a love letter to the idea of storytelling, particularly writing and traveling writing. But what really works is the different formats these stories take and the way those formats fit together or clash together. It's also interesting to look at each story and examine the way that reality, or at least Anderson's version of reality, and the eventual stories that came from that reality are related. What's included, what's left out. The ultimate question of the movie is, what is the heart of a story? And there's no easy answer, because there's no easy answer. It's up to you. What is the heart of this movie? You decide. And if that question doesn't interest you, you'll still get some really fantastic comedy out of Wes Anderson's usual cast of weirdos who take themselves too seriously, facing off against weirdos who don't. I don't know. I just like seeing Wes Anderson do his thing. It always works for me. I really hope he keeps making movies forever, because I like the idea that there will always be future experiences like this waiting for me over the horizon. My next selection is The Last Duel. This was the biggest surprise of last year, because historical epics and Ridley Scott are both very hit and miss for me, but this is my favorite example of both. The story shows 3 perspectives on one event that are all very subtly different and yet also inextricably connected. Everything has a purpose. Every look, every intonation, every slight variation on action or obvious differences between them. It's really interesting. The action is also spectacular. I mean, obviously Ridley Scott knows how to choreograph a good medieval action sequence at this point. The drama is what really gives the movie its punch, though. Matt Damon and Adam Driver are phenomenal in this. They both have this sense of masked insecurity, but barely masked. You can always see it kind of peeking around the edges. It's played perfectly. And Jodie Comer is unreal in this. She is a superstar, but above all else, the story is not just driven by the characters, it's driven by the world these characters live in, which feels so real and nuanced. You completely understand who these people are and why they are the way they are. And even though it's a very different time and a very different world than we live in, what rings very true is why people project fantasies of honor or romance onto scenarios they just feel the need to have control over. There's no romanticism of history, no sense that we have lost something we can't get back, just the best and worst of human nature. My next selection is Malignant. Malignant is the best movie ever made. Words cannot describe how this movie makes me feel, and it truly has to be seen to be believed. It starts off looking and feeling like a typical James Wan haunted house horror movie, similar to something like the Conjuring franchise, but it evolves into something completely unlike anything you will see from a major studio in 2021. They truly don't make them like this anymore, and I'm not a huge horror movie fan, but I love me some bat horror, and this is the most bat horror I have seen in potentially decades. And I think the reason why this one struck such a chord with me is that the modern horror movie landscape has gotten very quiet and dignified, if that makes sense. You know, the more patient, atmospheric movies, mostly coming from A24, which I also enjoy, but I think there's room in the genre for crazy shit like Malignant too. It's big and loud and dumb, but very, very obviously intentionally so, and it brings back so many of those weird stylistic flourishes from the early 2000s. It's kind of nostalgic in a way. This movie definitely won't work for everyone as well as it works for me. It hits a very specific niche, and I didn't even know I was part of that niche until I saw this movie, so I'm very glad I was able to discover that. I say we keep letting James Wan do whatever he wants for the rest of his career after this, because on the off chance that we get one more movie like this, I will watch 100. My next selection is Mass. Every year, I really love one movie that I am absolutely certain no one I know has ever heard of, and this year, it was Mass. Almost the entire story takes place in one room as the parents of the perpetrator and one of the victims of a school shooting sit down and talk about how the event has changed their lives. So obviously, in terms of scale, this is one of the smaller movies of 2021, but in that regard, it's also one of the most impressive. I found myself really fixated on the camera work in this, which I would call deceptively simple. The way the camera shifts distance and perspective and tone and steadiness and even aspect ratio later on all makes it feel like the room and the characters are evolving with the story. The emotion is very tightly controlled, and going in based on the premise and the scale, I was expecting at least a couple big emotional, please give me an Oscar style speeches, but there really aren't any. The movie stays very true to the idea that loss and grief and regret can kind of hollow you out, and you won't get the answer you want. You won't find closure if you just start screaming. And while there is closure to be found in this story, there's no easy answer. There's no way out, because the characters don't have an easy answer. They don't get a way out. It's more about letting go of the need to find an answer at all. And if that sounds a little too artsy or vague for you, it works in context, and you will find that context because you should watch Mass. Everyone should watch Mass. It's very, very good.
How he fought! How he died.
My next selection is The Matrix Resurrections. I've always loved The Matrix, but in 2021, The Matrix became my favorite series. I just really fell in love with the whole story it told, the entire tapestry of the Matrix universe. As a singular experience, though, what really made this movie click for me was the presence of Lana Wachowski's voice and experience in the story. This movie is very clearly a metaphor for how she's come to see her own creation. Primarily because Neo begins this story as an artist who created this piece of work that has had such cultural impact and meant so much to so many people, but the true point has kind of been lost over time, and the movie is about reclaiming that point. And when you look at how this movie reflects the rest of the Matrix franchise, narratively, philosophically, spiritually, you can see the real point of the Matrix again, because it's not about punching. It's always been a love story. It's always been about how human emotion triumphs over a system that wants to exploit that. And Lana Wachowski's evolution as a filmmaker and as a person gives this movie so many layers in terms of life and death and becoming the person you are supposed to be to break free of a system that wants you to be one thing and control you. In some ways, it is, I will admit, a messier film than the originals. It doesn't have that same kind of stylistic precision to it, but that's also, and this may sound weird, and a lot of you will hate me for this, it's kind of the point. The point is that you can never truly do the Matrix again. You can never recreate what that meant and what that did to movies and pop culture. And the people who made it can't be the people they were when they made it, because the world is not the world that it was when the Matrix came out. This movie gives me so much to think about. I feel like my brain's on fire, and as a fan of the Matrix, as a whole, as a complete story, it gives me everything I want. My next selection is The Mitchells versus the Machines. This movie is so amazingly impressive in every single regard. Every shot, honestly, every frame almost, is just packed with so much passion and energy. This is the kind of movie that I like so much, I don't really know what to say about it because the answer is everything. I love every second of it, especially in terms of being an animated family movie, which I am no longer the target demographic for, and I very rarely enjoy. But again, that passion, that creativity, that energy, it really drives the story forward because at every turn, you feel like the people who made this just loved making it so much. And that adds a lot of dimension to this story about family, about discovering yourself. And even though these people are all cartoons, they feel real. Another reason it works so well is because it could have easily not worked in someone else's hands. This could have been some lame, reductive message about phones bad, but it's not. It's never that. It's about connection, physical, emotional, and digital connection, and how they intersect in our modern world. The cast is fantastic, the music is surprisingly addictive, and for as many times as I've watched this movie, and it has been many times now, it's never lost any impact at all. This was my favorite movie of 2021, and on that personal note, I feel like I really saw this movie at a time where I needed to. I don't know, I guess it reminded me why I love movies, why I love creating, why I want to create art like this that makes these connections. I love the story, I love the characters, I love the comedy, but I'm also very grateful for what this movie made me feel, and there's nothing quite like that. And my final selection from last year is Nightmare Alley. I love Guillermo del Toro. I can't remember a time where he ever let me down, and this movie is no exception. It definitely feels very del Toro. I mean, you've got a story about men and monsters and the relationship between them, and also that kind of elegance and grandness that Guillermo del Toro does so well. Surprisingly though, I think this might be my favorite del Toro movie now. I really did not expect that going in, because that grandness and that elegance and that visual flair and the smooth flowing camera work, it all works so much more effectively for me in this story about people trying to repress their inner ugliness. And Bradley Cooper brings that idea to life perfectly by mixing together this sort of earnest boy next door charm with this quiet arrogance that you can always kind of see. I don't have too much to say about the specifics of the story because it was more about the big picture for me, more about the ride it took me on. I could feel myself kind of falling into this movie from the opening scene, and from there I was just so engaged with these characters, finding out more about who they were, what they were capable of, what they wanted to build, and how it would all fall apart. I just found it to be a really incredible journey all the way until the end, which is just perfect. So, those were my favorite movies of 2021. What a year it was. And I know many people are probably very shocked and confused that Kissing Booth 3 was not on this list. And deep down, I know it probably should be, but I couldn't. But yeah, overall, a pretty good year for movies, if only because we finally saw a lot of the ones we were supposed to see last year. I would say that 2021 was a very inspiring year for me because I discovered so many movies that made me want to keep watching new stuff and keep writing new stuff, just coming up with new ideas and sinking my teeth into new concepts. And I'm just trying to hold on to that energy going into this year. And as of right now, based on what's coming, I'm just feeling really excited. Although I will be honest, about 70 to 99% of that energy is focused directly at Morbius. I just want to see Morbius so bad. It looks so fucking terrible. I'm so excited.